The suspect no one questioned. A Miss Marple case. Section 1. The scream in the refreshment tent. The scream came from the refreshment tent at 20 minutes past 4, just as the vicar was drawing the winning ticket for the fruitcake. It was a small scream, a ladylike scream if such a thing exists, and then came the crash of crockery, and after that a silence so complete that the bees in Mrs. Tressider's lavender border could be heard from one end of the lawn to the other. Until that moment, the summer fete at St. Mary Mead had been proceeding with the tranquil predictability of 40 previous fetes. The vicarage lawn was decked with bunting that Miss Clara Vane had mended only that spring, 40 yards of it, some of the pennants dating from before the war, restitched so cunningly that one could not tell the new cloth from the old. The Women's Institute presided over the produce stall. Miss Hartnell was bullying people into guessing the weight of the marrow. The band from Much Benham had played Roses of Picardy twice, and the tea-urn had behaved, which everyone agreed was something of a miracle. Mrs. Adela Dalrymple of the Larches had been sitting in the place of honour, the wicker chair with the good cushion, set in the shade of the cedar, with a glass of damson cordial in her hand. She had been in excellent spirits. She had spoken sharply to her companion, Miss Wilkes, about the arrangement of the raffle tickets. She had complimented the vicar's wife, Laura Tressider, on her hat in a tone that contrived to suggest the hat was a mistake. She had drunk her cordial with every appearance of enjoyment, and then quite suddenly she had gripped the arm of the wicker chair, turned a dreadful greyish colour, and died. It was Nurse Bell who reached her first. Nurse Bell, brisk and competent in her starched district uniform, who had been buying a bottle of Mrs. Cray's damson gin at the next table. She loosened the dead woman's collar, felt for a pulse that was not there, and looked up with a face that had gone professionally blank. "Stand back, please. Stand back. Dr. Meadows. Is Dr. Meadows here?" Dr. Meadows was here, there, and everywhere, as he always was at village functions. He knelt beside the wicker chair for a long minute. When he rose, his mouth was set in a line the village had learnt to dread. "She's gone," he said quietly to the vicar. "Get people away, Tressider. Get them all away." But people do not go away at English village fetes. They cluster. They murmur. They hold their teacups a little tighter and say, "Oh, how dreadful," in voices bright with an excitement they would have been ashamed to name. The band, uncertain, began Roses of Picardy for the third time, and was silenced by a furious gesture from Colonel Easterbrook. Miss Hartnell announced to anyone who would listen that she had always said the damson gin would be the death of somebody, though she hastened to add, rather spoiling the effect, that Mrs. Dalrymple had not touched the gin, only the cordial. It was Miss Vane who thought of the practical things. Clara Vane, the little seamstress from the cottage by the church, who did everyone's mending and half the altar frontals in the county, folded her own work, a torn flounce of Mrs. Tressider's she had been repairing in the intervals of serving teas, and laid it in her basket with the neatness of a lifetime. Then she took the good cushion from behind the dead woman's head, very gently, so that Dr. Meadows could lay Mrs. Dalrymple back along the chair, and she covered the still face with a clean tea-cloth from the refreshment table. "Poor soul," Clara said, in her soft, threadbare voice. "Let her have a little dignity. She always liked things done proper." Nobody thought that odd. Clara Vane had done the laying out at half the deaths in St. Mary Mead for 30 years. She was the woman one sent for when things went wrong. Quiet, devout, self-effacing Clara, who had buried a husband and a daughter, and never been heard to complain. The vicar put a hand on her shoulder and murmured, "Thank you, Miss Vane," and the crowd parted for her as it never parted for anyone, because Clara was one of those people whom a village does not so much notice as lean upon. On the other side of the lawn, half concealed by the striped canvas of the coconut shy, sat an elderly lady in a lace cap, her knitting lying forgotten in her lap. Miss Jane Marple had seen a great many people die in her long life, though rarely in such public surroundings, and her mild blue eyes, eyes that Mrs. Tressider sometimes described, slightly resentfully, as far too noticing for a dear old thing, moved slowly over the scene. They rested for a moment on the wicker chair and the covered face. They rested on Nurse Bell, who was speaking in a low, urgent voice to Dr. Meadows. They rested on Miss Wilkes, the companion, who stood quite alone by the tea-urn with an expression that was not grief, an expression, Miss Marple thought, of a woman doing rapid sums in her head. They rested on a flushed young man in a cricketing blazer, Mr. Hugh Dalrymple, the nephew, who had come down from London that morning, and who was now staring at his aunt's body with his mouth slightly open. And they rested, last and longest, on Clara Vane, who had taken out her work again, quite without seeming to know she had done so, and was drawing a thread through the torn flounce with small steady stitches, her head bent, her lips moving very slightly, as a person will count, or pray, Miss Marple thought. Her needles began to move again, and she dropped a stitch without noticing, which was a thing Miss Marple almost never did. The police arrived from Much Benham at 5:45, in the person of Inspector Frost, a large weathered man, with the air of one who has never been surprised in his life, and does not intend to begin. He looked at the body, and at the glass of damson cordial standing unfinished on the little table, and at the crowd of villagers being held at bay by 2 constables and the vicar's embarrassed courtesy, and he sighed the sigh of a man whose evening has been spoiled. "Heart, I dare say," he said to Dr. Meadows, not hopefully. "She was how old? 70? 72, said Dr. Meadows, "and her heart was no worse than mine. I want that glass, Frost, and the jug the cordial came from, and I want them looked at by somebody who knows what he's looking for." Inspector Frost looked at him for a moment, and then at the glass, and something shifted in his weathered face. "You think—" "I think," said Dr. Meadows, "that I have never seen a heart seizure quite like that one, and I have seen a good many. That's all I say at present." The sun was going down over the vicarage garden, gilding the bunting, the careful mended bunting, every seam invisible, and the villagers began at last to drift homeward through the dusk, in 2s and 3s, talking in the low, eager voices of people who have been given something to talk about for the rest of the summer. Miss Marple went with them, her knitting bag over her arm, walking slowly, as an old lady must. At the gate she paused and looked back. The lamps had been lit in the refreshment tent. Against the striped canvas she could see the silhouette of Inspector Frost, and beside him a smaller figure, Clara Vane, patient as a chair, waiting to be told whether she might go home. She was still holding her work-bag. Even at that distance Miss Marple could see that her hands were quite still now, folded over the top of it, tidy and composed. "Poor Mrs. Dalrymple," said Miss Hartnell at Miss Marple's elbow, making her start, a thing Miss Hartnell had been doing to people for 20 years. "Though one must speak the truth, Jane, she was not a kind woman, not a kind woman at all. All the same," Miss Hartnell lowered her voice to a hoarse whisper that could have been heard in Much Benham, "to die like that, in front of everyone. It's the not knowing that's so dreadful. I mean to say, suppose it wasn't her heart." "Indeed," said Miss Marple gently, "I was wondering much the same thing," and she walked home through the lanes in the gathering dark, thinking, not of the dead woman, whom she had known for 40 years and never liked, but of a pair of small, steady hands drawing thread through torn silk, and of the way a certain voice had said, so softly, "She always liked things done proper." Section 2. The village takes its soundings. She always liked things done proper. The words seemed to accompany Miss Marple down the lane, as small and persistent as the moths that rose from the hedgerows in the dusk, and by the following morning they had acquired a good deal of company, for the news had done what news always did in St. High. Mary Mead. It had multiplied overnight like yeast. By 9 o'clock there was not a household in the village that had not its own version of Mrs. Dalrymple's death. At the post office, where Mrs. Chubb dispensed stamps and intelligence with the same moist impartiality, it was generally agreed that the damson cordial had done it, Mrs. Cray's damson cordial, made last autumn from fruit that had lain too long on the ground, and wasn't it a mercy nobody else had taken a glass, though Mrs. Chubb herself had always said that home-made cordials were a gamble at the best of times. At the Blue Boar, the commercial travellers' room inclined to the nephew, young Mr. Hugh Dalrymple, down from London with his pockets to let, as everyone knew, and heir to every penny of a very considerable fortune. In the back parlour of the wool shop, where Miss Marple sat at 10:30, apparently absorbed in the selection of a shade of pale blue for a baby's matinee coat, the opinion was more diffuse and considerably more interesting. "They say," said Miss Hartnell, who had followed her in with the inevitability of weather, "that Dr. Meadows sent the glass away, to be examined, Jane. Now what does that tell you?" "That Dr. Meadows is a careful man," said Miss Marple, holding 2 skeins up to the light. "It tells me," said Miss Hartnell, undeterred, "that there was something in that cordial that ought not to have been there. And I will tell you another thing, Jane Marple, though it goes no further." She leaned across the counter, dropping her voice to its celebrated conspiratorial foghorn. "Miss Wilkes, the companion. Mrs. Dalrymple was sending her away at the end of the month, without a character, if you please. Rose the housemaid told my Ethel, who had it from the postmistress's girl, that the 2 of them had words about it that very morning in the drive at the Larches, where anyone could hear. Cruel words, Mrs. Dalrymple said that after what she knew, Miss Wilkes would be lucky to get a situation in a laundry." "Dear me," said Miss Marple, "and what did Mrs. Dalrymple know?" "That," said Miss Hartnell, with the relish of a woman laying down a trump, "is what nobody has been able to discover, yet." The shop bell tinkled, and Laura Tressider came in, the vicar's young wife, pretty and flushed and looking as though she had not slept. She wanted crochet cotton for the edging of an altar cloth, and she wanted, even more plainly, to talk. "Isn't it too dreadful?" she said. "And on the vicarage lawn. The vicar is so upset he feels it reflects, though I keep telling him it reflects on nobody, and poor Miss Vane has been no use at all. She came up this morning to finish my flounce and simply sat and sewed and would not say one word about it, except that the funeral baked meats would want thinking about, which I call morbid, though father says it is only her way. Everyone is saying the strangest things, that it was the nephew, or the companion, or poor Nurse Bell, which is perfectly ridiculous, because Nurse Bell has looked after half the village since before we were born. Oh, and," she lowered her voice, glancing at Miss Hartnell with the air of one reluctantly sharing a bonbon with a person one does not like, "Colonel Easterbrook says there is to be an inquest. He had it from Inspector Frost himself." The little shop absorbed this in silence. An inquest. The word hung in the air among the balls of wool like a change in the weather. "I am sure," said Miss Marple at last, placidly, winding her pale blue skein, "that Inspector Frost knows his business. Such a large, dependable-looking man. He reminds me a little of Inspector Slack, who used to come down when I was younger. Do you remember, Miss Hartnell? He always made up his mind so quickly. It saved him a great deal of trouble, though I am not sure it always saved anyone else's." "Frost has arrested nobody," said Miss Hartnell with slight disappointment. "No," said Miss Marple, "not yet. She bought her wool and went out into the sunshine, and because her errands took her that way, or so she would have said, had anyone asked, she walked home along the lane that passed the church, and paused, as an old lady may, to rest on the low wall of the churchyard. The church door stood open. Inside, in the cool dimness, a woman was kneeling at the altar rail, not praying, Miss Marple perceived after a moment, but working, a length of linen across her knee, a needle in her hand. Clara Vane, replacing a worn strip of the frontal before the Sunday service. Her head was bent, and the lamplight caught the grey in her hair, and her hands moved with that small, tireless steadiness that the whole village knew, and nobody, in 40 years, had ever really watched. Miss Marple watched them now. They did not tremble. They had not trembled yesterday either, when they folded the tea-cloth over Mrs. Dalrymple's face. Miss Marple thought of the hands of Nurse Bell, brisk, professional hands that had trembled very slightly as they loosened the dead woman's collar. She thought of the hands of Miss Wilkes, which had been clenched so tightly round her handbag that the knuckles showed white. She thought of young Hugh Dalrymple's hands, which had been shaking outright. Everyone's hands, in fact, had said something yesterday, except one pair. "Talking to myself," said Miss Marple aloud, apologetically to the churchyard at large. "A bad habit of old age," and she went home to her garden, and sat among the roses, and did a thing she rarely permitted herself to do. She took out of her knitting bag not the baby's coat, but a small shabby notebook, and she wrote 3 names in it, and then, after a long pause, a 4th. Outside her window the village hummed with its theories, its alarms, its pleasurable horrors, the whole great loom of St. Mary Mead gossip working away, thread over thread, each voice laying its strand across the last. Miss Marple listened to it the way a woman listens to the wireless while she knits, not to the words, which were mostly nonsense, but to the pattern underneath. Somewhere in all that tangle, she was convinced, there was one thread that ran true, a dropped stitch in an otherwise perfect piece of work. and Miss Marple had spent 80 years learning how to find dropped stitches. That evening, as she sat by her window in the dusk, a police car came slowly up the lane and turned in at the gate of the Larches, and Miss Marple, watching its lamp sweep across the dark hedge, thought that Inspector Frost had finished asking his questions at the vicarage, and was now going, as policemen so often did, to look in the most obvious place for the most obvious person. She picked up her knitting. The pale blue wool was soft between her fingers, and she worked on into the evening, and if her needles moved a little faster than usual, and if once or twice she stopped and stared at nothing with those mild blue eyes, there was nobody there to notice it. At 10 o'clock, her daily woman, coming in with the cocoa, remarked that there was a deal of talk in the village about the nephew, Mr. Hugh, and that they said the inspector had been twice to the White Hart where the young gentleman was staying. "Has he indeed?" said Miss Marple, stirring her cocoa. "Twice. Dear me, how very busy Inspector Frost is being." And she said it in a tone, though her daily woman did not know Miss Marple well enough to hear it, that a connoisseur might use on being shown a painting that was almost, but not quite, right. Section 3. Inspector Frost follows the obvious. How very busy Inspector Frost is being. And indeed the inspector was busy. By the end of the week he had amassed a notebook full of facts, a box full of labelled objects, and a theory of such beautiful simplicity that it seemed a pity to disturb it with doubts. The facts were these. The analyst's report had come back from the county laboratory. The dregs in Mrs. Dalrymple's glass contained a formidable quantity of digitalin, the active principle of the foxglove, and the standard medication, in minute and careful doses, for precisely the kind of tired elderly heart that had beaten in Mrs. Dalrymple's breast for 72 years. Her own medicine bottle, found in her bedroom at the Larches, was a third empty and correctly prescribed. Someone had added a great deal more of the same to her cordial. The body, examined, confirmed it. Digitalin poisoning, of a slowness and certainty that had given her time to drink half a glass, to speak to 3 acquaintances, and to settle back in the wicker chair before the grey came into her face. The jug of cordial was innocent, only the glass was poisoned. Whoever had done it had not meant to kill the fate, had meant, with a care that Inspector Frost found curiously chilling, to kill one woman, and one woman only, in the middle of 200 people, with the whole village looking on. "Premeditated," said Frost to his sergeant, in the little room he had commandeered at the police station in Much Benham. "Premeditated, planned and executed by somebody with a cool head and access to the stuff. Now, who had access to digitalin?" The answer, as Frost assembled it, was embarrassingly wide. Anyone in Mrs. Dalrymple's household, where the medicine bottle stood openly on her night table. Nurse Bell, whose bag was a travelling dispensary and whose rounds took her in and out of the Larches twice a week, and, Frost's pencil paused here, a number of others, if one chose to think of gardens. Foxgloves grew in half the gardens in St. Mary Mead. A person would need to know what they were about, of course, to get the dose from leaf to glass. But country people knew such things. Country people had always known such things. "And the opportunity," said the sergeant. There the field narrowed. The glasses had stood ready on the refreshment table, and the cordial had been poured as people came up. But Mrs. Dalrymple's glass had been carried to her, as befit the chairwoman of the Fate Committee, in the place of honour under the cedar, and here testimony conflicted in the way testimony always did at village functions. Mrs. Chubb thought Miss Wilkes had carried it, since carrying things was the companion's function in life. Miss Wilkes said, with some spirit, that she had been sent to fetch a shawl at the time, and had touched nothing. 3 ladies of the Women's Institute believed the tray had gone round on its own, so to speak, in the general press of serving, and 2 small boys, crouched under the table in pursuit of a runaway cricket ball, deposed, with the maddening literalness of small boys, that a lady had put the glass down on the little table by the wicker chair ages before the old lady sat down. Which lady? The boys conferred. A lady in a print dress, they said. Half the women at the fete had been in print dresses. The nephew, though, said Frost, returning to the beautiful simplicity. Let's look at the nephew. The nephew, examined, rewarded the looking. Hugh Dalrymple was 28, charming, and broke. He owed money in London to people who were not patient. His aunt had kept him on an allowance of stringency and lectured him on it monthly, and had recently, this from her solicitor, an old man whose discretion had been eroded by 40 years of village dinners, spoken of altering her will. The estate, some £40,000, now came to him entire. He had been seen near the refreshment tent at the relevant time by 2 witnesses, and could give no account of himself for the half-hour before his aunt's death that did not sound, even to his own ears, like something invented in a hurry. On the second occasion that Frost questioned him, at the White Hart, the young man lost his temper. "This is fantastic. I hadn't touched her cordial. I didn't know what the stuff was. Digitalin. I had to look it up. And I hadn't the faintest idea she'd altered the will or hadn't altered it or whatever it is you're suggesting. My aunt and I rubbed along. She was a Tartar, but one doesn't murder one's relations for being Tartars, or half the families in England would be extinct. Where were you, Mr. Dalrymple, between 4 o'clock and 1:30? I've told you. I went for a walk, along the lane. The fate was stifling. Alone? Alone, said Hugh, and coloured, a slow, betraying red that rose from his collar to his hair, and that Inspector Frost noted with the quiet satisfaction of a man whose theory has just acquired its missing brick. It was on the following morning that Miss Marple, coming out of the butcher's, met the inspector himself on the pavement, and was recognised, for Frost, who had been a young constable in the county 20 years before, remembered an old lady whose evidence in the matter of the poisoned trifle at Gossington Hall had been, as he put it afterwards, uncomfortably right. Miss Marple, he touched his hat. Bad business, this. Very bad, said Miss Marple. Poor Adela. We were at school together, you know, Inspector. Oh, a long time ago. She was not an easy girl, and she grew into a difficult woman, but one does not like to think of anyone dying afraid. She was afraid at the end, I think. One could see it in her face. You were watching her. One watches people, Inspector. It is the great amusement of old age, indeed. I sometimes think it is the only one left to us, and people are so very like one another, in St. Mary Mead or anywhere else. Mrs. Dalrymple, drinking her cordial and arranging the village to her satisfaction, reminded me so much of Mrs. Saunders. You would not remember Mrs. Saunders. It was before your time, who managed the choir outings, and whose housekeeper poisoned her quite slowly over a year with weed killer in the soup. The resemblance is not in the poison, you understand. It is in the certainty. Mrs. Saunders was certain of everyone around her. Certain people make murderers, Inspector. They never believe anyone will dare. Frost looked down at the mild, knitting old face with an expression poised between amusement and unease. And have you a theory, Miss Marple? Oh, I never have theories, said Miss Marple, shocked. I have only little noticings. For instance, she paused, and a passer-by would have said the old lady had lost her thread. I notice that everyone in the village is asking who, and nobody at all is asking whoever would, which is a different question, and a much more interesting one. And I notice that poor Nurse Bell has not slept, and that Miss Wilkes has stopped crying. She cried a great deal the first day, which everyone thought so natural, and that young Mr. Dalrymple is frightened of something that is not the police. But that, said Miss Marple, gathering her parcels, is only an old woman's fancy. Good morning, Inspector. I am sure you know your business far better than I could know it for you. She trotted off down the pavement, and Frost looked after her for a moment, and then, being a sensible man, with a good theory and a full notebook, put the old lady out of his mind, which was, as he admitted afterwards, the moment he lost the case. Miss Marple went home by the long way, past the church. The bunting of the Fate was still up along the vicarage wall, nobody having had the heart to take it down. 40 yards of pennants stirring in the breeze, the old cloth and the new, the mended and the whole, all one bright, indistinguishable flutter. And on the steps of her cottage by the lich gate sat Clara Vane in the sun, mending a surplice, the white linen spread across her dark lap like snow, her needle dipping and rising, patient as the seasons. "Good morning, Miss Vane," said Miss Marple. "Good morning, Miss Marple." The soft voice, the neat head bent a fraction lower. "Sad times. Very sad. You are always at work, I see." "There is always work," said Clara Vane. "Things wear out. Things tear. Somebody has to make them whole again." She drew her thread through, and bit it off, and smoothed the mended place with her small flat hand, and the mend was invisible, the weave so perfectly matched that even Miss Marple's eyes, at that distance, could not find the seam. Section 4. The Convenient Young Man. The mend was invisible. Miss Marple carried that small observation home with her along the lane, as one carries a pebble picked up on a beach, turning it over absently, not yet knowing why it weighs more than it should. The village, meanwhile, had settled upon its villain. It did so with the comfortable unanimity of a jury that has lunched well. Hugh Dalrymple, London-bred, debt-ridden, heir to £40,000, unable to account for his movements, and observed to turn red when questioned, was so exactly what a murderer ought to look like that it seemed almost ungrateful to look further. He played cards at the fete, said Mrs. Chubb at the post office, and lost 3 shillings on the tombola with never a blink. A man that can hide his feelings over money, I said to my husband, can hide anything. And his walk, said Miss Hartnell. Along the lane indeed. The lane runs directly behind the refreshment tent. A child could have slipped through the laurels. A child, said Miss Marple mildly, did slip through the laurels. 2 of them, I believe, after a cricket ball. It is odd that we believe children when they tell us of the lady in the print dress, and disbelieve a grown man when he tells us of a walk. Because children, said Miss Hartnell with finality, have nothing to gain. The inquest opened on the Tuesday in the village hall, and adjourned, as inquests do, after the medical evidence, but not before the county had been treated to the word digital in the coroner's most sonorous voice, and not before every newspaper from Much Benham to London had discovered that the deceased's nephew stood to inherit and had been assisting the police with their inquiries, a phrase which, as everyone knew, meant the rope was practically measured. Inspector Frost was content. He was not a foolish man, but he was a tidy one, and the case against Hugh Dalrymple tidied beautifully. Motive, means, for the young man had visited his aunt's bedroom that morning to pay his respects, and the medicine bottle stood in plain sight. Opportunity, via the laurels, and a manifest lie about the walk. The lie, Frost found, he could even decorate. The red flush, the stammer, the hallmarks of a shallow, impulsive young man who had killed cleverly once and could not sustain the cleverness. He put it thus to Dr. Meadows on the Wednesday evening in the snug of the Blue Boar. "Impulsive," said Dr. Meadows, turning his glass. "Frost, I've known the boy since he was in knickers. He's a fool about money, and he's a fool about women, and I dare say he was somewhere on that afternoon he'd rather his aunt's solicitors didn't hear of. But digital in is not an impulsive poison. It is a poisoner's poison, patient, measured, invisible. You wait for it. You watch it work over 20 minutes and you do nothing. Whoever killed Adela Dalrymple stood within 20 yards of her while she died, and did not so much as fetch water." He looked up. "Does that sound like Hugh?" "It sounds," said Frost, "like whoever it was. And I can't hang a man for failing to sound like himself, Meadows. I can only hang the man the evidence points at." But it is to be recorded that the inspector did not, that week, apply for his warrant. Some itch of professional honesty, or perhaps merely the memory of an old lady's voice saying whoever would, kept his pencil from the final stroke. Miss Marple, that Wednesday, was doing something she had not done in 11 years. She was paying an afternoon call at the Larches. She went, she explained to the parlour-maid, to condole with Miss Wilkes, such a dreadful position for the poor lady, a guest and yet not a guest, with a house in mourning and her own future so uncertain. It was all so plausible, so exactly the errand of a village old lady with a soft heart and an inquisitive nose, that even the parlour-maid, who had been warned against the press, let her in. Miss Wilkes received her in the morning-room, among the shrouded mirrors and the smell of late lilies. She was a thin, erect woman of 50, with the wiped-out neatness that companions acquire, and her eyes, Miss Marple noted, were red-rimmed but dry, the eyes of a woman who has cried herself out, or who has decided that crying is a luxury for people whose situations are secure. "It is so kind," said Miss Wilkes in a voice like starched muslin. "Everyone has been kind, even the vicarage, though of course nobody knows what is to become of me. Mrs. Dalrymple had spoken of changes, and now everything is at 6s and 7s, and Mr. Hugh is at the White Hart being questioned, which is too absurd, since if anyone in this village had cause to wish her dead—" She stopped. Her hands, folded in her lap, tightened and loosened and tightened again. "I beg your pardon. I am not myself." "You had been with her a long time," said Miss Marple sympathetically. 11 years, said Miss Wilkes. 11 years, Miss Marple. I came when my sister died, meaning to stay a winter. She had a way of making the winter permanent. One was never quite dismissed and never quite kept. One was a piece of furniture that she had not yet decided where to put, and at the end, the starched voice for the first time frayed. At the end she told me I need not trouble to pack for abroad, as she would not be requiring me. After 11 years, in the drive where the gardeners could hear, she sat very straight. I did not poison her, Miss Marple. I will say that to anyone, but I will not pretend to grieve, and if that convicts me in the eyes of St. Mary Mead, then St. Mary Mead may make what it likes of it. My dear, said Miss Marple gently, I have lived in St. Mary Mead for 60 years, and I can assure you it will make what it likes of it, whatever you say. It is a village. Villages are looms, they must always be weaving something, and they do not much mind whether it is truth or not, so long as the pattern is pretty. But I mind. She leaned forward, her mild blue eyes on the other woman's ravaged face. Tell me, you were with her 11 years, who in all that time did Adela Dalrymple trust? And Miss Wilkes, who had answered the police 100 times with composure, looked at the old lady in the shrouded morning-room and gave for the first time an answer that was not quite composed. Trust? She said. She trusted no one. She used people. But if you mean, whom did she allow near her, week in, week out, year after year, without ever once watching her hands? She stopped again, and this time the silence was different. Not evasion, Miss Marple thought, but a woman hearing her own sentence arrive before she had finished it. No one, said Miss Wilkes flatly, rising. No one at all. She watched everyone. She watched everyone always. She rang for the parlour-maid with a hand that shook, and the call was over, and Miss Marple went out into the afternoon with the unanswered sentence tucked away beside the invisible mend and the word whoever would in the part of her mind where she kept the stitches that did not match the pattern. At the gate of the Larches she met Inspector Frost, coming up the drive with his sergeant and a paper in his pocket that she did not need to be told was a warrant. Ah, Miss Marple! He was almost jovial, a man with his case made. Paying calls? Condoling, said Miss Marple. Inspector, you are not, I hope, going to arrest that unhappy woman in there? Miss Wilkes? No, ma'am. He permitted himself a tolerant smile. It's the nephew we've come for, Hugh Dalrymple. I'm arresting him tonight. Then, said Miss Marple, I am sorry you should have the trouble of unarresting him later. Good evening, Inspector. And she went down the lane towards the church, where the bunting still fluttered along the vicarage wall, the old cloth and the new, the torn places so cunningly closed that no eye could find them, and she did not hurry, because hurrying was no longer among her accomplishments, but she thought all the way home, and her thoughts were not comfortable ones. Section 5. The Broken Thread. She did not hurry, but she thought all the way home, and it was while she was sitting in her own garden that evening, with her knitting in her lap and the scent of the roses coming up in the dusk, that Miss Marple dropped a stitch. She did not notice it at first. She was thinking of hands, Nurse Bell's brisk, trembling hands, Miss Wilkes's clenched ones, Hugh Dalrymple's shaking ones, and that one other pair, the small, steady pair, folded over a work-bag in the lamplight of the refreshment tent. And when she looked down, there it was, a little ladder of looseness, 3 rows down, running crooked through the pale blue pattern like a crack through ice. Now, there are 2 ways with a dropped stitch. One may unpick back to it, 3 rows of work undone, all those small patient loops sacrificed, or one may do what careless knitters do, hook the stitch up from below, pull the fabric a little this way and that, and trust that the tightness will not show. It always shows, not at once perhaps, and not to everyone, but to the eye that knows knitting, the place is there forever, a small knot of strain in the fabric, puckering the rows above and below it. Miss Marple sat looking at her own dropped stitch for a long time, while the light failed, the torn places so cunningly closed that no eye could find them. She got up, rather more briskly than was her custom, and went indoors to her telephone, an instrument she regarded with the suspicion of a generation that had written letters, and rang the vicarage. Mrs. Tressider? It is Jane Marple. Forgive me for disturbing you in the evening, my dear, but I have been thinking of the bunting. So melancholy to see it still up, like decorations after the guests have gone home, and Sunday coming. I wondered, Would it be a help if I came in the morning and took it down? Miss Vane mended it in the spring, did she not? It should go back to her folded properly. She likes things done proper, I remember her saying so. There was a pause at the vicarage end, the pause of a young woman wondering why the oldest inhabitant was proposing to climb step-ladders, and then Laura Tressider's voice, relieved at any offer in a week of gloom, said that it would be too kind, and that the bunting was looped along the garden wall, and that she herself would hold the ladder. "Then I shall come at 10, said Miss Marple, and rang off, and sat for some minutes with her hand resting on the silent instrument, feeling, though she would never have used so dramatic a word, afraid. It was not the fear of a woman who suspects a murderer. It was the fear of a woman who suspects she understands one. She slept badly, as old people do, and was at the vicarage before 10, where Laura Tressider, in gardening gloves, received the bunting as it came down, length by length, into a wicker clothes basket, 40 yards of it. The vicar, passing with a book under his arm, paused to say that it was good of Miss Marple, and that the village could not go on as it was going on, suspicion everywhere. Miss Hartnell refusing to speak to Nurse Bell over some fancied slight, poor young Dalrymple in a cell in Much Benham, and now the newspapers sending men in hats to photograph the refreshment tent. One begins to feel, said the vicar, sighing, that the evil one is walking about St. Mary Mead. He has walked about St. Mary Mead for as long as I can remember, said Miss Marple. One just does not usually notice his footprint in the flower beds. The vicar went on, vaguely troubled. Miss Marple and Mrs. Tressider worked down the wall, pennant by pennant, the blue and the red and the white, the pre-war cloth faded to softness, the new patches bright, until at the far end of the second length near the laurels, Miss Marple's fingers stopped. "How strange," she said. "What is it?" Laura straightened, pushing the hair from her eyes. "This pennant." Miss Marple turned it in her hands. It was a blue one, faded, the point neatly reattached where it had torn, and across its width, no longer than her little finger, a place where a rent had been closed with stitches so small, so cunning, so exactly matched to the weave that the cloth seemed whole. She had been shown such work all her life. She had complimented its maker on it, across tea-tables for 40 years. "Miss Vane's mending," she said. "One would know it anywhere. But Mrs. Tressider, when did Miss Vane mend the bunting?" "In the spring. April, was it? She did it at the church working party. It took her 2 whole afternoons. I remember because she would accept no help. She said the old cloth needed a woman's patience." Laura stopped. "Why?" "April," said Miss Marple. "Yes. But this mend, my dear," her fingertip rested on the invisible seam, "is not 3 months old. The thread is new. It has not faded. It has not weathered. This cloth was torn and mended within the last fortnight, since the bunting went up." She looked along the wall, to the laurels, to the striped roof of where the refreshment tent had stood. Something sharp caught this pennant and tore it. Something somebody was carrying, and it was mended at once, the same day, I should say, by somebody who could not bear that anyone should find a thing torn where she had charge of keeping things whole. There was a silence in which a blackbird ridiculously sang. "Miss Marple," said Laura Tressider slowly, "what are you saying? You cannot be saying that Clara Vane—" "I am saying," said Miss Marple, "nothing at all. I am an old woman holding a piece of bunting." But her hands, for the first time in many years, were not quite steady, and she folded the pennant away into the basket with the care of a woman laying something into a coffin. "I am saying only what I said to Inspector Frost, that everyone is asking who, and nobody is asking whoever would, and that when one finds the answer to the second question, Mrs. Tressider, the first answers itself, and one wishes, afterwards, that one had never asked." She would say no more, though Laura pressed her, and presently she took her leave, declining luncheon, and walked home very slowly through the village, past the wool shop and the post office and the Blue Boar, past all the friendly windows behind which St. Mary Mead sat weaving its loud, confident, "Wrong pattern, the nephew, while in her basket of the mind, beside the invisible mend and the unfinished sentence and the word whoever would, she laid a fourth thing, a strip of faded blue cloth, torn by something sharp, and mended before the day was out, by hands that had not trembled when a woman died 20 yards away. A pair of scissors, she thought, a bodkin, a needle case, any of the small sharp implements that a seamstress carries as other women carry keys, carries everywhere, carries to church, carries into the presence of death, carries through the laurels to the back of a refreshment tent, and that would tear bunting if one pushed through too quickly in the dusk light of a summer afternoon. Miss Marple sat down at her own fireside and took up the baby's coat, and unpicked 3 rows of pale blue wool back to the dropped stitch, and began them again. Some things, she thought, cannot be hooked up from below. Some things have to be undone, however good the work has been, however much it costs to undo it. Outside, the bell of St. Mary's struck 12, and down the lane, faint on the summer air, came the sound of the police car from Much Benham coming back into the village, and this time, though Miss Marple could not know it yet, it was not going to the White Hart. Section 6. What the gravestones remember. The police car came back into the village. It went, in fact, to the Larches, and it took away, for examination, the late Mrs. Dalrymple's medicine bottle, her engagement diary, and a tin cash box from her desk, and it left behind it, as police cars do, a wake of rumour that by evening had become a flood. They say, Mrs. Chubb informed the post office queue, that the will is not what it was, that there is a codicil, that the money does not all go to Mr. Hugh after all. They say, said Miss Hartnell at the butcher's, that Nurse Bell has been suspended from her rounds, pending. That was the word, pending. They say, said the vicar to his wife, with the helplessness of a good man watching his flock tear itself, that this village will never be the same again, and I am beginning to believe them. Miss Marple said nothing at all. She was sitting that afternoon where she had taken to sitting in the afternoons, on the low wall of the churchyard, in the sun, with her knitting, an old lady at rest, to whom the village had long ago learnt to pay no more attention than it paid to the gravestones, which was a pity in a way, since the gravestones, as Miss Marple had observed many years before, were among the most eloquent inhabitants of St. Mary Mead. She had read them all, over 60 years, and they told her what they always told her, that the village remembered the dead kindly and inaccurately, and that the past of St. Mary Mead was not past at all, but stood about in the long grass, waiting, as the past does, for someone to read it carefully. On the north side, under the yew, was a stone Miss Marple had passed 10,000 times without truly seeing, sacred to the memory of Arthur Henry Vane, died April 14th, 1919, aged 34, also of Margaret Rose, his daughter, died March 3rd, 1923, aged 4 years. Thy will be done. Clara Vane's husband, Clara Vane's little girl. Miss Marple sat and looked at the 2 dates, and the mild blue eyes were not mild at all for a moment, but very old and very sharp. 1919. A man of 34, dead in the April after the armistice. Influenza, she had always vaguely supposed. Half the stones of that year said so. And 1923, a child of 4, Margaret Rose. People did not talk of her. Clara had never talked of her. Quiet, devout, self-effacing Clara, who had buried a husband and a daughter and never been heard to complain, and the village, taking its tone from her as the village always did, had folded the 2 deaths away into its memory like mended linen, seam side down. And yet Miss Marple's needles had stopped. There had been something once, a long time ago, an old woman's gossip, a whisper about 1919 that had not been about the influenza at all. She sat very still, as she had learned to sit when an old memory was moving towards the surface, like a fish towards a fly. It came up at last, small and dark, from 60 years down. Mrs. Saunders, not the choir one, her mother-in-law, old Mrs. Saunders of the Mill House, saying to somebody, in Miss Marple's own drawing-room, in the year 1919 or 1920, died in the infirmary at Much Benham, my dear, and not of the influenza either, whatever the certificate says. There was some trouble over the nursing. Somebody gave him the wrong stuff, or too much of the right stuff, and it was hushed up because of the scandal. The matron was a cousin of somebody. A nurse was sent away. Clara was left with that baby and not a penny, and nobody ever so much as said they were sorry. A nurse was sent away. Miss Marple got up from the wall, slowly, an old woman's rising, and walked home through the village, and if her step was heavier than usual, nobody noticed, because nobody ever noticed Miss Marple's step. She went into her house and up her stairs, and from the back of her wardrobe she took down a thing she had not opened in 20 years. A japanned tin box of old letters and old papers, the whole slow sediment of 60 years in one parish. She sat on the floor among them, and read. The parish magazine of May 1919 recorded, in the vicar of that day's best prose, the death of Mr. Arthur Vane, after an illness contracted in the late war and aggravated in the infirmary at Much Benham, where he was nursed with devotion. It recorded the widow's grief in terms of edification. It recorded nothing else. But among the papers there was something else, a cutting from the Much Benham Gazette, folded small, kept as she kept everything. Infirmary Inquiry. At the resumed inquest on the body of Arthur Henry Vane, of St. Mary Mead, a verdict of death by misadventure was returned, the jury adding a rider that greater care should be observed in the administration of patients' medicines. A member of the nursing staff, whose name was not disclosed, had left the service of the infirmary, and below it, in the same issue, 2 inches away, as though the editor had not noticed what he had done, or had noticed perfectly. Among the recent donations to the infirmary funds, the committee acknowledge with especial gratitude the sum of 100 guineas from Mrs. Dalrymple of the Larches, St. Mary Mead. 100 guineas, in 1919, a fortune. Miss Marple sat on the floor for a long time, with the cutting in her lap. Adela Dalrymple. In 1919, a young woman of independent means, lately come to the Larches, much interested in good works, on the committee of the infirmary, on the committee, and the matron had been a cousin of somebody. The whisper came back whole now. The wrong stuff, or too much of the right stuff. Arthur Vane's medicines had been administered wrongly, and the nurse who administered them had gone away without a name, and the committee had acknowledged 100 guineas with especial gratitude, and a 4-year-old girl had grown up fatherless and died, and Clara Vane had spent the rest of her life in a cottage by the church, mending the village's clothes and the altar cloths of its god, patient as a chair, never once heard to complain. Thy will be done. Miss Marple folded the cutting away with hands that were, at last and for the first time, trembling like everyone else's. She understood now, or feared she understood, the thing no one in the village had seen because no one in the village ever looked at Clara Vane, the thing hidden in plain sight like a mend in old cloth, that Adela Dalrymple had not been killed by anyone who had anything to gain. She had been killed, 40 years late, by the person to whom she had done the thing that could not be forgiven, the thing she had bought her way out of with 100 guineas and the loss of somebody else's name, somebody else's career, somebody else's blame. And yet, and here Miss Marple sat up straighter, and the old sharpness came back into her face. It did not fit. It nearly fitted, which was worse, because the woman she had watched drawing thread through torn silk with steady hands at the moment of a death, the woman who had covered the face of the dead with a clean cloth, gently, and said she always liked things done proper, that woman had waited 40 years, and women who wait 40 years do not then kill their enemy in front of 200 witnesses and a police inspector's pension. Revenge that old does not hurry. Revenge that old is not a glass of poisoned cordial on a public lawn. Unless, Miss Marple thought, it is. Unless the waiting was not patience at all, but the mend itself. 40 years of closing the tear, day by day, stitch by stitch, until the cloth seemed whole, and something at last, some last tug of the thread, had torn it open again on the vicarage lawn. Something sharp caught this pennant and tore it. She had meant scissors. She was no longer sure she had meant scissors. Downstairs, the telephone bell shrilled through the quiet house, and Miss Marple rose from among her papers and went down to answer it, already dreading whose voice she would hear. It was Dr. Meadows, and his voice was strange. Miss Marple, I think you should know. There has been another death. Clara Vane was found this evening, in her cottage by the church. Dead, Miss Marple. She is dead, and there was a glass by her hand, and it smells of bitter almonds, and Frost has gone white as a sheet, because he has just remembered, we have all just remembered, whose name was never disclosed. Section 7. The Second Glass. Clara Vane is dead. The words moved through St. Mary Mead like frost through a garden, and like frost they blackened everything they touched, so that by morning nothing in the village was the shape it had been. She had been found by the woman who came in to do for her on Fridays, sitting in her chair by the hearth with her work-bag at her feet. The work-bag closed, the village noted later, everything folded away, everything tidy, and on the table beside her a glass that had held barley water, and in the barley water prussic acid, dead some hours. The evening before, the vicar had seen her lamp lit and her small shadow moving across the blind, doing, he had supposed, the mending. There was a letter on the mantelpiece, addressed to the coroner. It was short, and it was in Clara's fine, sloping copybook hand, and Inspector Frost read it 3 times standing in the little parlour that smelled of lavender and beeswax, and then he sat down, unbidden, and read it a 4th. I killed Adela Dalrymple. I have waited a long time. I make no excuse, and I ask no pardon, here or hereafter. What was done to Arthur was never answered for in this world, and I answered for it. Let no one else be blamed. I have mended what I could of this village, and harmed no one in it but her. I am sorry about the boy. C.V. I am sorry about the boy. Hugh Dalrymple was released from the cells at Much Benham before noon, white-faced and older by 10 years, into a village that could not look him in the eye, the village that had measured him for the rope a week since, while the murderess sat by the lich gate in the sun mending surplices. "A confession," said Frost, in the snug of the Blue Boar, to Dr. Meadows. His voice had the hollow satisfaction of a man whose case has closed itself while he was not looking. "A confession, and the means prussic acid, Meadows. She had it in the cottage, some old photographic stuff of her husband's, and now the motive, which none of us so much as sniffed. 40 years. 40 years she lived by the church and sewed for the altar, and all that time—" He broke off. "You knew about the husband, the infirmary business?" "I knew there was something," said Dr. Meadows heavily. "Old Dr. Brent told me once, when I was new to the practice. Told me as a warning, he said, about certificates and cousins of matrons. I never connected it with Clara. One never connected anything with Clara. That was her genius, Frost, if you can call it that. She was the woman nobody looked at." He was silent a moment, turning his glass. "And the digitolin, Adela's own bottle, dosed stronger, had Clara access to the larches?" "She sewed there," said Frost, "every month of her life, practically. Mrs. Dalrymple's linen was Clara Vane's preserve, has been for 20 years. In and out of the bedroom with the mending basket, and the bottle standing on the night table as natural as the clock. No one would have looked twice. No one ever did look twice." He drank. "And the cordial glass, carried through the laurels, the bunting torn. Did you know about the bunting? Miss Marple found it. Sharp as a needle, that woman. Uncomfortable, I call it." "And what does Miss Marple say now?" asked Dr. Meadows. Frost shrugged. "What is there to say? The case is closed. Confession means motive, suicide. It closes itself. I rang her this morning to tell her the boy was released and she could stop whatever wool gathering she was doing." He paused, and a faint frown crossed his weathered face. She said, "I wrote it down, because it was the oddest thing," she said. "But, Inspector, who mended Clara?" Dr. Meadows looked at him. "And then she rang off," said Frost. "Old ladies. And yet—" He did not finish the sentence. He finished his beer instead, but he did not enjoy it. Miss Marple at that hour was sitting in Clara Vane's cottage. She had obtained entry by means impossibly, almost immorally simple. She had told the young constable on the door that she had come, at the vicar's request, to see whether Miss Vane had left any church work unfinished. "Altar frontals, constable, do not wait to be finished." And the young man, who knew a harmless old churchwoman when he saw one, stood aside. The parlour was as the village would have expected, poor, spotless, and perfectly ordered. The work-bag stood on the table where the police had photographed it, and then, finding in it nothing but needles and thread and a half-mended flounce of Mrs. Tressider's, the flounce Clara had been sewing in the refreshment tent while her victim lay dying under a tea-cloth, had set it down again. Miss Marple opened it. Needle case, scissors, small and sharp, in a leathern sheath. Thimbles, too, a bodkin, carded thread, white and black, and the soft faded colours of old cloth. And at the bottom, folded flat, Miss Marple's heart went slow and heavy, the way it had gone at the churchyard wall, a strip of blue bunting cloth, 2 inches wide, snipped neatly from somewhere. Kept for what? For matching. A seamstress keeps a snippet of the cloth she mends, so that the next mend will be true. So the bunting had torn, and Clara had mended it, and had kept the snippet. All true, all exactly as Miss Marple had reasoned. And yet, who mended Clara? The question she had flung at poor Frost like a stone into a pond, and heard the silence come back from. She sat down in the dead woman's chair, not the chair by the hearth. She could not bring herself to that, the other chair where Frost had sat. And she looked about the little room, at the 40 years of patience it contained, and she asked it the question she had not been able to put out of her mind since Dr. Meadows' telephone call in the night. A woman waits 40 years. She nurses her wrong through a widowhood, through the death of her only child, through 10,000 days of mending other people's things. She never complains. The village calls it patience, and it is patience, but patience of a kind, Miss Marple thought, that has a direction, like water lying quiet behind a dam. And then, one summer afternoon, at a fete, in front of 200 people, she lets it through. Why then? Why, after 40 years that afternoon? What happened on the vicarage lawn, Miss Marple asked the silent room, that had not happened in 10,000 days before it? Something, she thought, something happened at that fete. Something was said, or seen, or brought to light. Some last tug on the thread, and the dam that had held for 40 years gave way in a single hour. Find that something, and the case is alive again. Failed to find it, and here Miss Marple stopped, because she had come, by a road she did not like, to the thing she had been not thinking since midnight, that the confession on the mantelpiece answered everything a policeman could want answered, and did not answer that one question at all, that it read, to her old ear, not like a woman's voice, but like a summary of a woman's voice, neat, complete and closed, like everything else in the cottage, like the work-bag, like the folded flounce, like a mend. And there was the other thing, the smaller thing, the thing she had noticed at the fete and filed away, and only now, in this terrible room, understood. She always liked things done proper. Clara had said that of Adela Dalrymple, had said it gently, covering the dead face, but Miss Marple had known Adela for 40 years, and Adela had not liked things done proper. Adela had liked things done hers. The phrase did not describe the dead woman at all. It described— Miss Marple sat very still. It described the speaker. It was the kind of sentence a woman says of herself, standing over the body of her enemy, in the voice of a verdict. Or, and the cold came up through Miss Marple's veins like water rising in a well, or it was the kind of sentence said by somebody else altogether, repeated, heard, remembered, quoted. Miss Marple got up and closed the work-bag with a small soft click and went home to think, and all down the lane the pennants stirred on the vicarage wall, the old cloth and the new, for the bunting was still up, nobody having yet had the heart to finish what Miss Marple had begun, and behind her, in the cottage by the church, the lamp of the watching constable shone through the little window where, for 40 years, another lamp had burned, and a bent head had sewed, and a whole village had never once looked twice. Section 8. Miss Marple's Test, and a whole village had never once looked twice. The phrase stayed with Miss Marple all the way home, and was still with her that evening by her fire. It was, she thought, the truest thing anyone could say of Clara Vane, and it was the thing that was wrong, because a village that never looked twice could not have made Clara Vane what the newspapers were now making her. The Much Benham Gazette made her a figure of Greek tragedy. The London papers preferred village fiend and guise of church mouse. Neither portrait had anything to do with the woman who had bitten off her thread and smoothed the mended place with her small flat hand. Both were patterns woven by the same loom, only the picture changed. It was the loom one had to watch, she thought, not the picture. She picked up her telephone and rang the vicarage. Mrs. Tressider, Jane Marple. My dear, I have been thinking about poor Miss Vane's things. There is no family, I understand. A cousin in Wales who telegraphed that she could not come, which told one all one needed. Somebody must go through the cottage before the police give it up, and it should be someone who knew her. I wondered, would you come with me? And perhaps we might ask Nurse Bell to step in as well. She is at leisure, poor thing, with this dreadful suspension, and she was fond of Clara, I think. And Miss Wilkes, if she will come, she is still at the Larches, is she not? Until the house is sold. 4 women. We shall get through it in an afternoon. Laura Tressida, who had been dreading the task alone, accepted with a gratitude that quite drowned her mild surprise at the guest list, and it was left at Friday. Miss Marple put down the telephone and looked at it for a moment with something not unlike compunction. "Forgive me," she said aloud to the empty room. "It is not a kind thing I am doing. But then, it was not a kind thing that was done." Friday was fine. They met at the Lich Gate at 3 o'clock. Laura Tressida, pale and resolute. Nurse Bell, out of uniform for the first time in living memory, looking oddly naked in a brown coat. Miss Wilkes, erect and watchful, and Miss Marple herself, leaning a little on her stick, very much the old lady, apologizing for being slow. Inside, they set to work, as village women do, with the efficiency of grief. Laura took the linen press. Nurse Bell took the kitchen. Miss Wilkes, at her own request, took the little desk in the corner, where Clara's accounts were kept in the same fine copybook hand as the confession, and Miss Marple sat in the chair by the hearth. She had to sit, she said. At her age one sat when one could, and watched. Laura talked, the way the young talk when they are sad and busy, of the funeral, of the flowers, of whether it was wrong to ring the bell for a suicide. Nurse Bell answered in brisk monosyllables from the kitchen. Her professional calm was back on her like a uniform, and Miss Marple noted that it did not fit quite as well as it had. Once, when Laura said, "To think of her sitting here planning it all those weeks and us never knowing," there was a pause from the kitchen, a fraction too long, before the monosyllable came. Miss Wilkes said nothing at all. She went through the dead woman's papers with dry efficiency, and once Miss Marple, apparently dozing, saw it through her lashes. Once Miss Wilkes stopped over some paper, and was still for a long moment, and then went on, and the paper went, not onto the pile she had been making, but into the fire. It curled and blackened, and nobody had seen it but Miss Marple, who pretended to wake. It was Laura who provided the moment, innocently, catastrophically, as the young provide such moments. She had come to the bottom of the linen press, and she straightened up holding a small cardboard box, and she said, "Oh, the poor soul, look, it's the baby's things." There was a silence that was different from the other silences. Inside, folded in yellowed tissue, were a child's mended garments, a little coat, booties, a smocked frock, every seam fine, every worn place darned to invisibility, kept for 50 years in a room where nothing else had been allowed to grow old, and beneath them, at the very bottom, a photograph, a young woman in the dress of 1915, holding a child, and beside her a thin young man with laughing eyes, Arthur Vane, who had sung in the choir, and on the back, in a hand that was not Clara's copybook hand but a looser, older scrawl, the words, "For dear Nurse Vane, who could not save him either. God forgive us all." "Oh, how dreadful," whispered Laura, with tears starting. "How perfectly dreadful. Her husband, and then the little girl, and she kept it all these years." "Put it back," said Nurse Bell. Her voice was not brisk now. It was not anything Miss Marple had heard in it before. She had come to the kitchen door unheard, and stood looking at the box in Laura's hands, and her face was grey, not with shock, Miss Marple thought, but with recognition. "Nurse?" Laura turned, startled. Did you know?" "About the little girl." "I nursed her," said Nurse Bell. The room went absolutely still. Miss Wilkes had risen from the desk. Even the fire seemed to lower itself. "It was my first year on the district," said Nurse Bell. She came in and took the photograph, and looked at it, and Miss Marple saw that her hands, the brisk, competent hands that had trembled at the fate, were trembling now beyond all concealment. 1923, diphtheria. I was 22, and I knew everything, and I nursed her day and night, and she died on the 3rd night, and I have never—" She stopped. She put the photograph back in the box with terrible gentleness, and closed the lid, and when she spoke again her voice was flat and hard and utterly unlike the cheerful district voice the village had known for 40 years. "Clara never blamed me. That was the worst of it. I blamed myself. I nearly left nursing over it, but Clara never did. She sat by that child's bed and sewed, and when it was over she said to me, 'You did all that could be done, nurse. I know what it is to watch somebody die and not be able to mend it.' And I believed her. All these years, I believed." She broke off and looked round the little room at the 3 women watching her, and something in her face gave way, and Miss Marple saw, with the pang of a woman whose trap has caught what it was set for, and wishes it had not, that Nurse Bell had understood the thing the whole village had missed. That the woman who had said, "I know what it is to watch somebody die and not be able to mend it," had been speaking not of her daughter, but of her husband, of the infirmary at Much Benham 4 years before, and that the words had been not comfort, but an account rendered. "She waited," said Nurse Bell in a whisper. "All those years, sitting by me at parish meetings, mending my uniforms, she waited. And she never—" She turned on Miss Marple suddenly, with the violence of utter bewilderment. "But why now? She forgave me, or she didn't, but she bore it. She bore Mrs. Dalrymple for 20 years of mending her linen, week in, week out. Why, in God's name, after 40 years at a fete, in front of everyone?" "Yes," said Miss Marple quietly, from her chair by the hearth. "That is the question, is it not? The only question that matters. And I think, nurse, that you are the person best placed to answer it, since you, alone of all of us, were at the refreshment tent that afternoon, with your bag, your travelling dispensary, I believe Inspector Frost calls it, standing open on the ground beside Mrs. Crazed Damson Gin." And in the silence that followed, a silence in which Laura Tressider's hand went to her mouth, and Miss Wilkes took one sharp step back from the desk, Nurse Bell looked at the old lady by the fire, and the last of the briskness went out of her face, and what was left was something Miss Marple had not expected at all. It was relief. "So," said Nurse Bell, "you've seen it. I've been waiting, Miss Marple. Since the night Clara died, since I read that lying letter, I've been waiting for someone to see it." Section 9. The pattern underneath. "I've been waiting for someone to see it." The words hung in the little parlour like the last note of a bell, and it was Laura Tressider who broke the silence, with the small practical bewilderment of the young. "See what? Nurse? See what?" The letter was in Clara's own writing. Inspector Frost said, the whole village said. "The whole village," said Miss Marple from her chair, "has been saying what it has been told to say in Clara Vane's own hand, which is a very different thing from saying what is true. Nurse Bell, tell them what you told me on the telephone. Nurse Bell rang me at 7 this morning. We have been waiting, both of us, for this afternoon." Nurse Bell sat down heavily in the dead woman's other chair. Out of uniform, in the brown coat, she looked smaller than the Nurse Bell of the village's imagining, and she spoke to Miss Marple as one witness to another. "I read the letter at the inquest, like everyone else, and I stood there listening to my own profession being used to hang a dead woman, and I couldn't speak, because the one thing I knew was the one thing I couldn't prove. Miss Marple, that letter is wrong." "Wrong how?" said Miss Wilkes sharply. Miss Marple, watching her, thought, "She burnt the paper. She has her own reasons for wanting to know where this goes." "Wrong medically," said Nurse Bell. "Wrong in a way no nurse of my generation would write. The letter says, the paper said it said, what was done to Arthur was never answered for. Everyone took that to mean the infirmary, the wrong medicine, the nurse who was sent away. Very well, but Arthur Vane died of digitalin poisoning. I've known it since Tuesday. Dr. Meadows got the old infirmary records at my request. I couldn't sleep for old Dr. Brent's gossip. Digitalin, the same drug. Do you understand me? The same drug, the same slow grey death that killed Adela Dalrymple 40 years later. Arthur Vane's nurse didn't give him the wrong stuff by accident. His medicine was interfered with, and the nurse who was sent away without her name, I found her. She's 81, in Bournemouth, and kept her mouth shut 60 years because they pensioned her, but she talked to me." Nurse Bell's voice had gone hard and level. "She gave Arthur Vane his medicine as prescribed, and it wasn't her fault, and she was sent away because a lady on the committee put up 100 guineas for the infirmary funds, and the matron was her cousin, and somebody had to carry the blame, and a probationer from the workhouse was cheaper than a scandal, and the reason the medicine was interfered with," she stopped and swallowed and went on, "was that Arthur Vane, who sang in the choir and laughed and was 23 and beautiful, was loved by somebody who could not have him, because he was married to Clara." The fire ticked. The bell of St. Mary's struck 5, and nobody moved. "Adela," said Miss Marple softly. It was not a question. Adela Dalrymple, said Nurse Bell, 23 herself that year, new to the Larches, rich as Croesus, on the infirmary committee, and seen, remembered after 60 years, with hatred, at Arthur Vane's bedside more often than a committee lady has any business to be, and seen once coming away from the medicine room with a key she had no right to, and after he died, the 100 guineas and the probationer's name in the fire, and Mrs. Dalrymple of the Larches went on being the First Lady of St. Mary Mead for 40 years, and Clara Vane mended her linen. Nurse Bell's voice cracked at last like ice. Sued for the woman who murdered her husband and hanged a nurse for it, and never said a word, for 20 years. Until the fate, said Miss Marple. Until the fate, said Nurse Bell. And that, Miss Marple, is what I cannot get past, because I knew Clara Vane, and I tell you that the woman who bore Adela Dalrymple for 20 years did not kill her on a summer afternoon over a glass of cordial. Something happened at that fate. Something broke in her, or broke for her, and instead we are all swallowing a letter that says she planned it like a general, and took prussic acid out of a photographic bottle, and I am telling you, she leaned forward, I am telling you as a nurse of 40 years that the prussic acid is the second thing wrong. People who take prussic acid do not fold their work and close their work bag and put a letter on the mantelpiece. They haven't time. It kills in minutes, in convulsions, in a mess. Clara was found tidy, sitting in her chair, tidy, with everything folded. That is not a suicide. That is— She stopped and her face went grey again, and the room understood with her. That is a laying out. Somebody laid her out. Somebody who knew how a dead woman ought to look, and made her look it. She always liked things done proper. Nobody said it aloud, and afterwards each of the 3 listeners would have sworn that Miss Marple had. But Miss Marple had not spoken. She was sitting very still, her mild blue eyes on the fire, and in her mind the pattern was coming together at last, like a piece of knitting whose whole shape suddenly declares itself in the last rows. The dropped stitch, the invisible mend, the new thread in old cloth, the letter that answered everything a policeman could ask, and the one question that mattered, why now, after 40 years, at a fate? The phrase that did not describe the woman it was spoken of, but the woman who spoke it, or the woman it was quoted from. Who mended Clara? Miss Wilkes, said Miss Marple without turning her head. You burned a paper this afternoon when you thought the rest of us were busy. I am an old woman, and old women are supposed not to see things, and I am afraid I saw that. I do not ask you what it was. I ask you only, was it a letter from Adela Dalrymple to Clara Vane, and was it written a week before the fate? The silence this time was of a different quality. Miss Wilkes stood by the little desk, and her thin face worked once, and was still. You are a terrible old woman, she said at last, almost inaudibly. Yes, said Miss Marple simply. I have been told so before. It was the draft, said Miss Wilkes, among Clara's papers, the draft of a letter, not sent, or sent and this the draft, I don't know. I burnt it because— her voice, the starched muslin voice, frayed utterly, because I have spent 11 years being that woman's creature, and I know what she was, and I thought that with her dead, and Clara dead, and the nephew arrested, it might all simply be allowed to lie, that the village might be allowed to keep its simple story. I am not a good woman, Miss Marple. I am a tired one. What did the letter say? Said Miss Marple. Miss Wilkes closed her eyes. It said, she answered, that Mrs. Dalrymple had lately had cause to review certain events of the year 1919, that she had reason to believe that Miss Vane had for many years been in possession of knowledge which she had chosen to withhold, that she, Mrs. Dalrymple, was not a vengeful woman, I remember the phrase, it was like her, like poisoned honey, but that the infirmary business was to be reopened by certain persons who had got wind of it, and that if Miss Vane wished her husband's name to rest as it was, and the child's grave to rest as it was, she would attend Mrs. Dalrymple privately at the fete behind the refreshment tent at 4:15, where the matter could be settled between ladies without— Miss Wilkes's voice failed altogether— without publicity. At 4:15, said Miss Marple, behind the refreshment tent, where the laurels come down to the bunting on the wall. She raised her head, and her eyes were no longer mild at all. Mrs. Dalrymple did not die at 4 by chance. She died where she had appointed to meet the woman she had wronged, to buy her or break her a second time. She summoned her executioner ladies. She wrote the appointment with her own death, and addressed it and posted it 40 years in advance. She got up, leaning on her stick, and the 3 women drew back before her without knowing why. "And now," said Miss Marple, "I must go home and think very carefully about a glass of barley water, and a work-bag closed by hands that were not Clara's, and a photograph inscribed to Nurse Vane, which I found strange at the time, and stranger since, and about who, in all of St. Mary Mead, loved Clara Vane enough to mend her death for her." Section 10. The reveal in the vicarage drawing-room. Who, in all of St. Mary Mead, loved Clara Vane enough to mend her death for her. Miss Marple went home along the darkening lane with the question walking beside her like a companion, and by the time she reached her own gate she had answered it, and the answer was so quiet, so exactly of a piece with the pattern that had been in front of them all from the first afternoon, that she stood a full minute at her own doorstep with her hand on the latch, unwilling to go in, for she had been made a fool of. That was the thing that hurt an old woman, not the death of a difficult schoolfellow, and not the death of a patient seamstress, but that a mind she had watched, and known she was watching, had watched her back with an equal steadiness, and had contrived to hide behind her, behind the very shape of an old lady's noticing, and had almost succeeded. She sent a note by the boy from the Blue Boar to Inspector Frost at Much Benham that evening. It was very short. "I should be grateful," she wrote, "if you would come to the vicarage tomorrow at 4 o'clock, and would bring with you Dr. Meadows and Mr. Hugh Dalrymple. There is a small matter to be settled concerning the death of Clara Vane, upon which I think I can be of service to you. Jane Marple." Frost read the note twice. He remembered what Miss Marple had said down the telephone. Who mended Clara? He put on his hat. They gathered in Mrs. Tressider's drawing-room the following afternoon, which was a Saturday, and hot, the last hot day of the summer, though nobody yet knew it. The vicar had been taken by his wife to look at a Norman font in Little Worsley, and the drawing-room, with its chintzes and its silver photograph frames, and its faint smell of beeswax, contained, when the church clock struck 4, 7 people: Inspector Frost, glowering; Dr. Meadows, gaunt and interested; Hugh Dalrymple, thinner by 10 pounds and older by 10 years, sitting very upright, as men do who have lately been in a cell; Miss Wilkes, in the black she had lately assumed and now plainly could not afford to keep up; Nurse Bell, out of uniform for the 2nd time in a fortnight; Laura Tressider, because, as Miss Marple had said, some things must be witnessed by the vicarage; and in the 7th chair, a wing chair by the window, drawn a little away, so that the low sun fell across the small folded hands and the tidy grey head, sat the person for whose sake the meeting had been called. It was Miss Marple herself who had asked her, "Would you come, my dear? There will be tea. Nobody knew Clara as you did, and I think, when I have said what I have to say, you will wish to add a word." She had come, of course. She could not come. To decline, in the face of an old lady's mild request, before the vicarage and the police, would have been to unpick a stitch that had been held for 40 years, and this was not a woman, Miss Marple thought, who unpicked. This was a woman who mended. "I am obliged to you all," said Miss Marple, sitting very upright with her hands folded on her stick, "for humouring an old woman. Inspector, I will not be long. I have not the strength for long explanations, and this village has had enough drama for one summer, but it has not, I think, yet had truth, and until it does, the poison will lie in the ground of St. Mary Mead like digitalin in the roots of a foxglove." Frost inclined his head. Nobody else moved. "There have been 2 deaths," said Miss Marple, "and the village has been offered, in succession, 3 explanations. First, a wicked nephew. That was Inspector Frost's, and it was wrong, and I do not blame him. Mr. Dalrymple was very obliging in the matter of turning red and taking solitary walks. Second, a wronged widow, with a 40-year grudge and a bottle of prussic acid. That was the letters, and it was a very fine letter, and it was wrong too, though it was so nearly right that it nearly persuaded even me. Third, and this we heard yesterday, in Miss Vane's cottage, that Mrs. Dalrymple had summoned Clara to meet her at the fete, to threaten her over an old scandal, and that Clara, driven at last past bearing, killed her. That was Miss Wilkes's, and it is the truth of the first death. Adela Dalrymple was killed by Clara Vane, exactly as her own letter says, killed with her own medicine, at her own appointment, in the shadow of the laurels behind the refreshment tent. The dam that had held for 40 years gave way, ladies and gentlemen, precisely as I feared it had, and the bunting was torn by the scissors in Clara's work-bag as she pushed through, and the torn place was mended the same afternoon, because that was the woman she was. Hugh Dalrymple made a small sound and put his face in his hands. "But Clara did not write that confession," said Miss Marple, "and Clara did not take prussic acid. Clara was murdered." The inspector's chair creaked. "Miss Marple—" "I know, Inspector. I know what I am saying. Hear me out, and if you do not agree at the end, I shall never say another word on the matter. Clara Vane killed Adela Dalrymple in a moment of 40 years' grief, and she went home that evening to her cottage by the church, and she did what such a woman does. She sewed. She mended Mrs. Tressida's flounce, which was found finished in the work-bag. She said her prayers, and I believe, though I cannot prove it, that she wrote her own letter to the coroner, in her own hand, and confessed. And she meant, I think, to go to Inspector Frost in the morning. She was not a woman who ran from a bill." Miss Marple's voice had gone very gentle. "And that would have been the end of it, and a sad end but a clean one, if there had not been another person in St. Mary Mead who loved Clara Vane. One other person, only one, who could not allow her to hang for a woman who had murdered her husband and buried her name." She turned her head, slowly, and looked at the wing chair by the window. "Nurse Bell," said Miss Marple, "would you tell them what you told me last night, on the telephone, at 11 o'clock, after you had been to see this lady? And would you tell them what she said to you at the door, when you asked her whether she had sat with Clara Vane on Thursday evening?" Nurse Bell rose. Her face was white, and her hands, the brisk hands, were trembling openly, but her voice, when it came, was the voice of the district nurse of 40 years, brisk and level, and made for bad news. "She said Nurse Bell, "I sat with her, yes. She had done a wicked thing, and she meant to hang for it. I could not permit that. Adela Dalrymple hanged one innocent woman with 100 guineas, and I would not let her hang another with a letter. So I gave Clara her barley water, and I sat with her, and I closed her work-bag when she was gone, and I wrote what needed to be written in the hand I had copied for 40 years off the parish accounts, because Clara was my friend, and because, and this is what she said, Miss Marple, this is exactly what she said. She always liked things done proper." The drawing-room was so still that the clock on the mantelpiece could be heard, and the bees in the vicarage lavender, and somewhere far off a child in the village calling. In the wing chair by the window, Miss Hartnell, who had made up the tombola, and bullied people about the marrow, and brought altar flowers every Sunday to the church where Clara Vane sewed the frontals, and had sat by Clara's bedside through her influenza in 1937 for 3 nights running without sleep, sat with her hands folded neatly in her lap, and looked at Miss Marple with an expression that was not shame, and was not defiance, but was something older and more terrible than either, the expression of a woman who has finished her work at last, and is content to lay it down. "You always were," she said, quite quietly, "far too noticing, Jane, for a dear old thing." And then, because she was Miss Hartnell of St. Mary Mead, and because she had bullied the village for 50 years and did not intend to stop now, she added, with a small crisp nod to Inspector Frost, as one giving instructions about the marrow, "You had better take me away, Inspector. It is quite time. I have made things tidy." Section 11. After the bunting comes down. I have made things tidy. Miss Hartnell walked out of the vicarage drawing-room on Inspector Frost's arm as she had walked into 1,000 parish meetings, upright, brisk, disapproving in a general way of the weather, and if her hand on the inspector's sleeve trembled a little, only Miss Marple, sitting very still by the tea-table, was near enough to see it. The village heard the news at evening, in the way villages hear such news, not from the police, who said nothing, and not from the vicar, who said less, but through some invisible capillary between kitchen and kitchen, so that by evening every household in St. Mary Mead knew that Miss Hartnell had been driven to Much Benham in a police car, and that she had not cried, and that she had asked whether somebody would remember to feed her cat. There was no trial in the end. The heart that had bullied the marrow gave out 3 weeks later in the County Remand Hospital, quietly, in the night, as though, Dr. Meadows said, it had only been waiting for permission. She left her small savings to the church roof fund and her workbox to Nurse Bell, and a note pinned to the workbox in her firm hand. For the district. Clara would have wished it. The village mended, as villages do. Hugh Dalrymple went back to London a chastened young man, with his aunt's £40,000 and the first useful fright of his life. He was heard of later as a partner in a respectable firm, and a subscriber to the Infirmary Appeal. Miss Wilkes, to everyone's mild astonishment, was left a small legacy in a codicil nobody had known about, and took a cottage in Cornwall, and wrote once a year at Christmas to Miss Marple in a hand that grew, year by year, a little less like starched muslin. Nurse Bell went back on her rounds. The suspension was quietly lifted, and if her step was a little heavier than it had been, her hands, laying out the last patience of her long career, were steadier than ever, and Clara Vane was buried, at Miss Marple's private request to the vicar, beside her husband and her daughter under the yew, and the stone above her, paid for by a village subscription, carried, after her name, only the words, "She mended what she could." Miss Marple went to the burying, and stood at the back, and did not stay for tea. She walked home alone. The bunting was down at last. Laura Tressida, on the Monday, had taken it in from the wall herself, length by length, with the wicker basket at her feet, and had done a strange, small, private thing. She had gone through the pennants one by one, and marked every place where Clara's mending was to be found with a tiny stitch of red silk on the seam side, so that whoever came after should know. "So that we do not forget," she said, half defiant, half ashamed, "so that we do not go on not looking twice." "My dear," said Miss Marple, "I think that is a very good idea. Villages that do not mark their mends forget where the tears were, forget, in the end, that there were tears at all. And that is how one begins, you know, to be the sort of place that does not notice a Clara or a Miss Hartnell." She sat in the vicarage garden that afternoon, the last of the summer, the roses going over, and Laura brought her tea. "I do not understand," Laura said at last, "how she could have done it. Miss Hartnell. 50 years in the village, and the tombola, and the altar flowers, and it was her all the time, and she was not sorry." "She was not sorry for what she did," said Miss Marple gently, "but she was sorry, my dear, for what had been done. That is quite a different thing, and it is not, alas, the same as being good. Miss Hartnell loved Clara Vane. She had loved her, I dare say, in her difficult, dry way, since they were girls together. She had watched Adela do to Clara what Adela did, and she had watched Clara mend the woman's linen for 20 years afterwards, and it had eaten at her patiently from the inside, until in the end she could not bear that Clara should pay a second time for a wrong Adela had not paid for once. She did not kill Adela. Clara did that. But she was, how shall I put it, Clara's second self. She could not endure that Clara should be hanged, and so she mended. She has always mended. That was her sin in the end, that she thought she could mend anything. That murder, too, is only a torn place, if the seamstress has a fine enough hand." She stopped and looked at her tea. "It is my sin also," she said, "in its small way. I have watched this village for 60 years, and I have thought I could tell, from behind my knitting, which of us would do what, and I was quite wrong about Miss Hartnell. I heard her hoarse voice in the wool shop and thought, there is a good tiresome woman. I did not see her hands. She had steady hands, Mrs. Tressida, as steady as Clara's, as steady as a nurse's ought to be. I ought to have seen it at the fete, the one pair of hands besides Clara's that did not tremble. But Miss Marple, you did see it, in the end." "I saw the mend," said Miss Marple. "It was Nurse Bell who saw the woman, and I hope I shall remember that, at my age, when I am next tempted to be pleased with myself." The light was going. In the vicarage lane the lamps came on one by one, and along the churchyard wall where the bunting had hung, the ivy was already beginning to reclaim the stones. Somebody's cat crossed the grass. From the Blue Boar came the faint sound of a piano. "There is one thing I do not understand," said Laura, after a while. "Only one, my dear? You are wiser than I. The phrase. She always liked things done proper. Clara said it, at the fete over Adela's body, and Miss Hartnell said it, in the wing-chair of Clara. Was it Clara who said it first, or Miss Hartnell?" Miss Marple was quiet for a long moment. The bees had gone in. A blackbird was giving its evening notes to the dusk. "I think," she said at last, "that it was Adela who said it first, long ago, of somebody she was punishing. And Clara heard it, and remembered it, and used it back on her at the end, gently, because Clara did not raise her voice even for a verdict, and Miss Hartnell heard Clara use it in the refreshment tent, and remembered it in her turn, and used it of Clara in the wing chair when it was her turn to make things tidy. 3 women, my dear, 3 women in the same village, over 40 years, passing one small proper phrase from hand to hand like a piece of mending. That is what a village is, you know. Not the houses, and not the church, and not even the people, exactly. It is the phrases we pass along. Some of them keep us warm. Some of them—" She paused and smiled a very small, very tired smile at the going light. "Some of them are the rope we hang each other with, in the end, when the time comes to be tidy." Laura Tressider looked at the old lady in the failing garden, and did not answer, and Miss Marple presently got up and gathered her knitting into her bag, the baby's coat, finished at last, the dropped stitch invisible now to any eye but hers, and went home through the village. The lamps were lit in the cottages. Behind one of them, the little cottage by the lurch gate, a new tenant, a young curate, was reading his sermon by an oil lamp, in a room that smelled faintly, still, of lavender and beeswax. Behind another, Nurse Bell was writing up her daybook. Behind a third, Mrs. Chubb was telling somebody, in confidence, the truth about the Dalrymple case, which was not quite the truth, but near enough for a village to live with. And behind Miss Marple's own window, when she reached it, the fire had been lit by her daily woman against the first chill of autumn, and the kettle was on, and her cat was on the rug. She sat down by the fire. She took up her knitting. Outside the window the last of the pennants, one, overlooked, faded blue, hung from a nail on the churchyard wall, and stirred faintly in the September air, and by morning the wind would have taken it away altogether, and there would be nothing left along the vicarage wall but the bare stone, and the ivy, and the small red stitches on the seam side that only the vicar's wife and one old lady with mild blue eyes would ever know were there. The end.